Hello there everyone, this is Miriam, holistic life coach and MindBody practitioner at Pain Outside the Box. And in this video, I'm going to be sharing how I personally overcame the problem of insomnia and poor quality sleep. It's a subject that I have avoided up until today because it took me quite a while to feel confident to share what worked for me, because sleep issues were one of the hardest mind-body challenge for me personally. So in this video, I won't be talking about stuff like sleep hygiene, sleep habits, or how much caffeine you should be taking or not taking in order to sleep better. I'm sure that if you have had sleep problems for a long time, you've looked into these issues and they're not working so well for you. So in this video, I'm going to be tackling insomnia from a mind-body perspective and explain how we can work with our brains, with our attitude, in order to shift and change this problem, in order to overcome it. So let's get started. Insomnia and poor quality sleep is a very debilitating problem that tends to come side by side with anxiety and depression sometimes also alongside chronic pain. And the fact that it does come alongside these issues is not a coincidence. It's usually because there is an underlying emotional problem behind it. My own issue started when I was working on a job that required a rather long commute, and I was putting pressure on myself to wake up by a certain time in order to be able to beat the worst of the traffic. Because I knew that I needed to wake up by a certain time, I was making pressure on myself, and what was happening was that I would wake up in the middle of the night, let's say to go to the bathroom, or I would just wake up from a dream, and I would look at the time, and I would see, for example, it was 4 a.m. and I only had 2 more hours of sleep. And what would happen was that I would not be able to fall back to sleep. So I ended up getting very short nights most of the time, which made me feel terrible the next day. Now, personally, I need around 8 to 9 hours of sleep. It's not the same for everyone, but I know by now that unless I get my 8 hours of sleep, I feel demotivated the next day. Cognitively, I'm not fully there. I can't focus. I don't feel energized at all, and I feel drained. So I usually need that amount of hours. And what was happening at that time was that I was not getting the sleep that I needed, and I was getting extremely anxious and worked up about it. I would go to work, and the only thing I could look forward to were my coffee breaks, which would provide me with, let's say, a half an hour of a little bit more focus. But that is all. Coffee just didn't do it for me. If I didn't sleep well, I felt just horrid the next day. So I realized that this was part of the problem for me. Not only was I making pressure on myself to wake up by a certain time, which obviously sent me to bed already a little bit on the alert, but also I realized that these sleep problems were so much more difficult for me to overcome than, for example, the debilitating symptoms, the chronic pain I had had some years prior. The only reason for this was that I actually found them more threatening. I knew that if I didn't sleep, I would not feel able to function well the next day. It would feel like a lost day for me, like just a lot of suffering. And because of that, I actually started to perceive lack of sleep as the biggest threat to my existence. And as I explain also in other videos, these chronic conditions are actually fed by a lack of safety. Whether it's chronic pain because you feel unsafe with your body, or insomnia because you feel that not sleeping is a threat to you, there's always an element of feeling unsafe behind chronic conditions. And the reason why for me personally, it was so much harder to overcome sleep problems than it was to overcome chronic pain was that with chronic pain, having learned that there was a mind-body element and that my body was essentially okay and free from illnesses, I was able to accept the pain more. I was able to tell myself, okay, it's annoying, it's painful, but it's okay. You know, I was not as bothered as I was bothered by not being able to sleep when I had the sleep maintenance insomnia. So this is obviously different for everyone. There would be people who would perceive chronic pain as a bigger threat than sleep problems, for example. But in my case, I realized that I was perceiving poor quality sleep as a bigger threat for me than I was perceiving my chronic symptoms beforehand. And that's what was making it so hard to overcome this problem. In fact, eventually I left that job that required me to wake up by a certain time, and I thought that I would solve my problems because then I didn't have the pressure to wake up, then I was doing something that I loved more, so I thought that would solve it. But actually it didn't. What happened was that my sleep problems transitioned slightly, and I would not sleep well the night before I had planned something fun. So let's say I had planned to go out climbing for the day, or we planned a trip, and the night before I would not be able to sleep, or I would have very, very broken sleep that would have me wake up feeling totally awful and worse than I'd felt when I had gone to sleep the previous night. So what happened was that now my sleep problems were sabotaging the fun I was supposed to have on certain days. And they would come up mostly when I needed to be the most energized, in the best state in order to have fun or to function. And it was pretty tough, right? Because the more I wanted to be well rested, the less rested I was. And especially if we visited a new place, usually I would not sleep at all that first night, which would make the first day pretty draining, not as fun as it was meant to be. So that was the new threat for me. The threat now was that sleep would sabotage my fun. It would sabotage my happiness. And so it did, because mind-body problems tend to become self-fulfilling prophecy. If we're afraid that we're going to get chronic pain, we're likely to get chronic pain. If we're afraid that we're not going to sleep well, we're likely not going to sleep well. So in that way, all these mind-body issues actually work in the same way. And this is what helped me overcome my insomnia and sleep problems in the end. I started to look into what I did for my chronic symptoms and what I was doing differently for my sleep problems. And as I explained before, I realized that with my chronic symptoms, I had got myself into a state of acceptance and non-resistance. I had stopped resisting the idea that my symptoms were life-threatening. But with sleep, I wasn't doing that. I was still perceiving a bad night of sleep as hugely threatening to myself. So that's where I realized that I needed to bring in a little bit more acceptance for the fact that I might not sleep so well after all. And I know that this is the last thing you want to accept if you have these problems. If you have these problems, you want to try out maybe medication, you look into sleep habits, anything that you can take or do in order to improve your sleep. But what I realized for myself is that the more of these things I did, the less it worked. So just to mention a couple of things that I did to try and beat my insomnia in this way, I did, for example, certain sleep meditations right before I went to sleep. They would really relax me, but as soon as the meditation would stop, usually I would be wide awake again. Or I would go to sleep, but I would still wake up an hour later and not be able to maintain my sleep. I would occasionally also take melatonin, which is a sleep hormone that actually promotes sleep. What would happen was that I would likely fall asleep, but 2 hours later, again, I would wake up and not be able to fall back to sleep, and then I would get anxious again about how awful I would feel the next day. So obviously, I realized that the more I was trying to fight my sleep, the less successful I was. Another thing I realized I had done for my chronic pain, but that I was not doing for my sleep problems, was the talking about my issue. So I would talk about my sleep problems with my friends the next day when I was feeling tired. I would tell my mom because she would ask me how I slept. At the same time, my mom was also having some sleep issues, so she would tell me, and we would go back and forth every morning, updating each other on whether we had slept well or not. I realized that this was not helping. It was making the sleep problems into a bigger issue, into a threat again, into a problem that we were identifying with. And once I realized this, I made this rule. I told my mother, like, let's not talk about it every morning. Let's not analyze how well we slept. Let's just leave it there. The same thing that I did with my chronic pain once I realized it was a mind-body issue. I stopped talking about it with family and friends. You might think it's a small thing, but it's a huge thing, because when you stop talking about a chronic condition as a problem, you stop giving it life, you stop giving it fuel, and you start to minimize it. And this is what we need to do in order for our brain to perceive it as a smaller threat, in order for our brain to stop perceiving it as such a huge problem or threat. So I did these two things to overcome my insomnia. I stopped talking about the issue as much as I could, and I stopped resisting the idea that I might not sleep. Of course, the latter was the hardest thing to do because I really wanted to fall asleep and to stay asleep and to feel rested and refreshed the next day. But what I would tell myself were things like, all right, if I don't sleep, then so what? I've gone through this before, I'll survive, then the next day I'll be so tired, I'll be bound to catch up on sleep. Okay, I might not have the day I want to have, I might not be energized, but so what? So I used a lot of so what statements to counter my resistance, to stop wanting to sleep so much. Because when we want something so much to an extent that it creates anxiety, then of course it defeats the whole point. So what I wanted to do in the moment was going to sleep with the acceptance that, I might sleep, I might not sleep so well, it's fine, without the usual expectations, without the usual pressure that had been accompanying me previously. And in fact, then I noted this is how people who do not have sleep issues go to sleep. They don't go to sleep thinking and wishing desperately to sleep well. They just go to sleep assuming that they are going to fall asleep and have a good night's sleep. And it was this assumption that I had to build for myself, that I had to cultivate. I had to go to sleep with the assumption that, I'm going to fall asleep, but without that desperation, without that strong wanting to go to sleep. I had to make it into a given, into a natural thing again. I used to think, how did I go to sleep when I was a kid? I just went to bed and I just fell asleep. I didn't go to bed thinking, oh, I wish I would sleep quickly. I wish I would stay asleep, blah, blah, blah. So it's that mindset that I had to work myself towards. And that is really the key, actually, to try to emulate the mindset and the attitude of someone who does not have the problem. It's easier said than done, but when we've had a chronic problem for a long time, we obviously tend to change our attitude. We start to resist it to an extent that we create more and more anxiety, and we fuel the problem. We make it bigger. So the idea, as I always say also in the case of chronic pain, is to make it smaller. And one thing I should add here, because I know that a lot of you have looked up various strategies, various material on how to get to sleep. And I know we got a lot of advice on sleep hygiene and screen time, to avoid being on the phone right before you go to bed and to avoid all sorts of stuff before you go to sleep. But here's the truth. People who do not have sleep problems, people who are good sleepers, they can do almost whatever they like. They can look at their phone if they want to before they go to bed. They can watch an action movie before they go to sleep. And they still are able to fall asleep. So I'm not saying that these things don't help, but they're really not the big picture. They're just a small element of it. If you're a good sleeper, you can sleep almost anywhere. You can handle minor noises. If you wake up because there's a noise or a sound, you're able to go back to sleep without much thought and anxiety. Okay, everyone has the occasional bad night. Sometimes even a really good sleeper might have a bad night if he finds himself in, let's say, a noisy hotel. But the difference between a good sleeper and a person with insomnia is that the good sleeper would assume again the next night that he's gonna sleep, and he would not get all worked up about not being able to sleep again. He would not start to get hyper-vigilant on any noises and sounds that might threaten his sleep, as some people do. That is the difference, that certainty, that assumption that one's going to go to sleep because it's a natural process. That's what's supposed to happen. And the only thing that prevents this natural process are, unfortunately, sometimes our own thoughts. Our own thoughts that are perceiving a threat to our own sleep. So as I started to implement these shifts bit by bit, gradually I started to sleep better. It did not happen overnight. I'm not even sure when it happened, but one day I just looked back and I thought, I'm actually sleeping much better. I'm actually waking up to go for a climbing session without having to deal with that feeling, that awful feeling of having had really broken sleep the previous night. It's amazing. So just to recap, for those of you who are suffering from sleep problems and insomnia, here's what I recommend. Number 1, don't constantly talk about your lack of sleep or your sleep problems with family or friends. Even with yourself, try to be less critical about the issue. If you don't sleep well, just accept it as soon as you can and assume that you're going to catch up and you're going to fall asleep the next day. Number 2, when you go to bed, go with the assumption that you are going to fall asleep and just focus on how comfortable it feels in the bed, how nice it feels to be in your room. Just focus on the softness of the bed in order to take your mind off wanting to fall asleep. Sleep will come naturally. You can never force it. Number 3, try not to do anything specific to try and get to sleep. Taking pills or melatonin might work occasionally, but if you do so every day to try and force yourself to go to sleep, you're actually fighting the condition. And fighting it is never the answer. Eventually, it's going to get back at you. If anything feels like you're fighting the condition, just back off. This actually includes practices like meditation. If you do a meditation before bed specifically to try to get to sleep, that might sabotage your effort. You can definitely meditate during your day. You can definitely do a calming meditation or a body scan just to relax. But your intention behind it has to be just to relax. It cannot be to force yourself to sleep, otherwise it might backfire. And ultimately, I cannot stress enough the topic of acceptance. Accept that sometimes you might not sleep, sometimes you might not have an ideal life, and that's okay. That's not the end of the world. Okay, so every time you find yourself resisting the idea that you might not fall asleep, that's the time for you to let go of that resistance. Ask a so what question. So what if you're not going to sleep the whole night? By actually doing that, you're increasing your chances of actually sleeping better that night because you are just releasing that tension, that sense of wanting to fight the problem that's actually at the very root of the problem. That's all from me for today, and I wish you a lovely week ahead. Bye-bye.